They told me I would become something more than human. They told me I would become an instrument of order, a manifestation of the Emperor's will, a perfect soldier in gleaming white armor. They told me my old name would fall away like dead skin, and that I would be reborn with a designation that carried the weight of galactic authority. They told me many things during those first days at the Karita Academy, and I believed every word because I had no reason not to. I was 17 standard years old. I had never left my homeworld. I had never seen a star destroyer except in Imperial holovids, had never touched plastoid armor, had never fired a blaster at anything other than swamp rats in the fields behind my family's moisture reclamation station on Dantooine. I thought I understood sacrifice. I thought I understood discipline. I thought I understood what it meant to serve something greater than myself. I understood nothing. My name was Kyle Vosk before I arrived at Karita. I need to write that down, to commit it to this recording, because there are days when I cannot remember it. There are days when the only thing that feels real is the designation they gave me, TK-4479, and the weight of the helmet I wore for so many years, the way it pressed against my temples and filtered my breath and made my voice sound like every other voice in the ranks. But I was Kale once. I was a boy with a mother who sang old Dantooine harvest songs and a father who died when I was 11, crushed beneath a malfunctioning harvester droid because we could not afford proper maintenance. I was a boy who dreamed of the stars, who collected Imperial recruitment hollows and watched them until the projector unit burned out, who believed that the Empire represented civilization itself, a bulwark against the chaos that had swallowed my father, against the poverty that gnawed at our bones, against the meaninglessness of a life spent coaxing water from an ungrateful planet. The recruiter came to our settlement when I was 16. He wore the crisp gray uniform of an Imperial Army liaison, though I would later learn he was nothing more than a quota filler, a man paid by the head to find bodies for the academies. He told us stories of honor and purpose, of careers that could lift entire families out of poverty, of pensions and medical care and housing on the gleaming worlds of the core. He showed us holovids of stormtroopers marching in perfect formation through the boulevards of Imperial Center, their armor catching the light like snow under a clear sun. He told us that the Empire needed young men and women willing to defend its ideals. He did not tell us what those ideals would cost. 12 of us from the Dantooine settlement signed our names that day. 12 boys and girls who had never known anything except dust and drought and the slow grind of poverty. I remember their faces now. Tayla with her crooked smile. Bren, who always talked about opening a cantina on Naboo someday. Little Syrah, who was only 15 and had lied about her age because she wanted to escape her stepfather's fists. I remember all 12 faces, though I am the only one still alive. The others are dead or worse than dead. And I carry them with me the way a soldier carries shrapnel lodged too close to the spine to remove. The transport to Karita took 6 days through hyperspace. We were loaded into the cargo hold of a converted freighter along with 200 other recruits from across the Outer Rim. Mining colony brats from Kessel, factory workers' children from Ariadu, orphans from the resettlement camps on Ryloth. We slept on hard benches and ate nutrient paste from tubes and listened to orientation recordings that played on a continuous loop. The recordings told us what to expect: the rigorous training, the physical conditioning, the mental fortitude examinations. They told us that not everyone would complete the program, that the academy had standards to uphold, that washouts would be reassigned to labor battalions or support roles. They made it sound like a test we could study for, an examination with right answers and wrong answers, success and failure measured in clean percentages. They did not tell us about the attrition rates. They did not tell us that the academy at Karita accepted 10,000 recruits every quarter and graduated fewer than 3,000. They did not tell us where the other 7,000 went. I learned, eventually. We all learned. Karita from orbit looked like a wound in space, a planet of red deserts and black mountain ranges and training facilities that sprawled across entire continents. Our transport descended through an atmosphere choked with dust and the residue of weapons testing, and I pressed my face against the viewport and tried to feel excited. Tried to recapture the sense of destiny that had burned so brightly when I signed my name on that recruitment form. But there was something wrong about the planet, something I could sense even then. The light was too red. The shadows were too deep. And when we landed and the cargo bay doors opened and the heat struck us like a physical blow, I heard a sound I had never heard before. A rhythmic thudding like a massive heart beating somewhere beneath the earth. It was the sound of training exercises. Live fire drills, demolition testing, artillery barrages. That sound never stopped, not once in the 14 months I spent on Karita. Day and night, the planet shook with the violence of 10,000 training scenarios playing out simultaneously. Sometimes, I would lie awake in my bunk and try to distinguish individual explosions. Try to count the detonations like a child counting sheep. But they blurred together into a continuous roar that became as familiar as my own breathing. When I finally left Karita, when I was finally permitted to leave, the silence was worse than the noise had ever been. I did not know how to exist without that constant reminder of destruction. They processed us in batches of 50. We were stripped of our civilian clothing, our personal belongings, our names. A medical droid scanned each of us in turn, cataloging our biometrics, noting our heights and weights and blood types, and any pre-existing conditions that might affect our training. My file recorded that I was 1.83 meters tall, 71 kilograms, blood type B negative, with a minor calcium deficiency in my left femur from childhood malnutrition. The droid did not ask if I was afraid. The droid did not ask me anything at all. It simply logged my data and assigned me a number, TK4479, and moved on to the next recruit. TK, Terror and Kinetic. That was the designation prefix for Stormtrooper trainees. They told us it stood for something else in the official documentation, something bureaucratic and meaningless. But the drill instructors made sure we understood the real meaning. We were being forged into instruments of terror. Our bodies would become kinetic weapons, our minds would become extensions of imperial will, and our old identities would be burned away until nothing remained but the designation and the duty. They shaved our heads that first night. All of us, male and female alike, lined up in the processing center while efficiency droids ran clippers across our scalps and let the hair fall to the floor in drifts of brown and black and red. I had worn my hair long on Dantooine, the way my father had worn his, and I felt something inside me die as I watched it fall. The girl beside me was weeping, silent tears tracking down her cheeks, but she did not make a sound. We had already learned that sounds drew attention, and attention from the instructors was never a thing you wanted. Taylor stood 3 places behind me in that line. She was not crying. She was staring straight ahead with her jaw set and her hands clenched at her sides. And when the droid finished with her scalp, she walked to the distribution point and collected her trainee uniform without a word. I tried to catch her eye, tried to give her some small gesture of solidarity, but she looked through me as though I were already a stranger. Perhaps I was. Perhaps we all became strangers to each other the moment we surrendered our names. The barracks were designed for maximum efficiency and minimum comfort. 40 recruits to a room, bunks stacked 3 high, a single refresher unit with 6 showers and 4 toilets for all 40 of us to share. We had 4 minutes every morning to complete our hygiene routines. 4 minutes measured by a timer that shrieked at exactly 05:15 hours and did not stop shrieking until the last recruit was standing at attention beside their bunk. Anyone who failed to meet the deadline received punishment detail. Anyone who failed 3 times was transferred to the reconditioning program. We did not know what reconditioning meant. Not at first. The instructors used the word casually, almost carelessly, the way you might mention a minor bureaucratic inconvenience. Recruit TK4Y521 has been transferred to reconditioning. Reconditioning will correct these behavioral deficiencies. Consider reconditioning if you cannot maintain academy standards. It sounded administrative. It sounded like a second chance. It was not a second chance. But I am getting ahead of myself. The memories do not come in order anymore. They bleed together like watercolors in the rain, and sometimes I cannot tell which horror came first and which came after. The chronology is less important than the truth. And the truth is this: the Academy at Karita existed for one purpose and one purpose only: to break us, to shatter whatever we were before and reshape the fragments into something useful. The training was not designed to make us better soldiers. The training was designed to make us soldiers at all, to transform civilians into weapons through a process of systematic destruction. Day 1 introduced us to the basic structure of Academy life. We assembled in formation at 05:30, performed calisthenics until 700, ate a breakfast of protein slurry and vitamin supplements, and then marched to our first classroom instruction. The classroom was a vast auditorium that could hold 1,000 recruits, and we sat in rows of hard plasteel chairs while holo projectors displayed imperial doctrine and training manuals on screens 3 stories tall. The first lesson was about the history of the Stormtrooper program, how it had evolved from the clone troopers of the Republic, how the Emperor, in his wisdom, had recognized the need for a new generation of soldiers drawn from the citizenry of the Empire, how we were the inheritors of a noble tradition stretching back to the Clone Wars. They showed us holovids of the clone troopers in action, their white armor gleaming as they swept across battlefields in perfect synchronization. They told us that the clones had been limited by their genetics, their programming, their accelerated aging. They told us that we, natural-born humans from across the galaxy, would surpass the clones in every way because we chose to serve, because our loyalty was not manufactured but genuine. They told us we were special. They lied. I learned the truth about the clones much later, from a veteran sergeant with cybernetic eyes and a voice like gravel scraping across Dura steel. He had served in the final years of the Republic, had fought alongside clones in the Outer Rim sieges, had watched Order 66 execute itself with mechanical precision across 100 worlds. He told me that the clones had been better soldiers than any of us could ever hope to become. Faster, stronger, more disciplined, more capable of absorbing punishment and continuing to fight. He told me that the Stormtrooper program existed not because natural-born humans were superior, but because clones were expensive to produce, and the Emperor needed bodies. Millions of bodies, tens of millions. An endless supply of expendable soldiers to garrison the galaxy and suppress any hint of resistance. "You're not heirs to anything," the sergeant told me once, late at night in a cantina on some forgotten space station. "You're just cheaper to replace." But I did not know that on day 1. On day 1, I believed I was special. On day 1, I sat in that auditorium and watched the holovids and felt my chest swell with pride and purpose. On day 1, I was still Kyle Vosk in my heart, still the boy from Dantooine who dreamed of the stars, still naive enough to believe that the Empire valued me as an individual rather than as a unit of production. By day 30, I had learned to stop believing. The physical training began on day 2 and did not stop until the day we graduated, or the day we washed out, or the day we died. Every morning we ran. 10 kilometers on day 2, 15 on day 3, 20 by the end of the first week. We ran through the red dust of Karita's training grounds, through sandstorms that stripped exposed skin raw, through heat that made the air shimmer and dance. We ran in formation, maintaining precise intervals, our feet striking the ground in unison like the pulse of some enormous machine. Anyone who fell behind was dragged to their feet by instructor droids and forced to continue. Anyone who fell behind, repeatedly, was taken away. The running was only the beginning. After the morning runs came the obstacle courses, walls to climb, trenches to crawl through, pools of cold water to swim across while weighted down with training packs. Then came the hand-to-hand combat drills, where we learned to strike and grapple and choke with our bare hands. Then came the weapons training, where we practiced with training blasters that delivered painful but non-lethal shocks every time we missed a target. Then came the classroom sessions on Imperial doctrine, military tactics, equipment maintenance, first aid. Then came the evening calisthenics. Then came the 4 hours of sleep we were permitted before the cycle began again. My body broke down in the first week. Everyone's body broke down in the first week. The medical droids patched us together with Bacta patches and pain suppressors and stim injections. And we continued training because the alternative was reconditioning. And none of us knew yet what that meant. But we knew it was something to be feared. I watched recruits vomit from exhaustion and then keep running. I watched recruits collapse with heat stroke and get dragged to the medical center and return to training the next day with haunted eyes. I watched recruits whose bones had been pushed past their breaking point continue to drill with limbs wrapped in temporary casts, their faces tight with agony they were not permitted to express. Pain was the first lesson Karita taught us. Not how to avoid pain. That was impossible. But how to endure it. How to function through it. How to make pain irrelevant to the execution of our duties. The instructors called this stress inoculation, a clinical term that made the systematic torture sound almost scientific. They explained that combat would be painful, that wounds would be painful, that death itself would be painful, and that the only way to prepare us for these realities was to acquaint us with suffering in controlled doses. The doses were not small. The doses were not controlled. We suffered, and we learned to suffer in silence. And eventually we learned to suffer without even acknowledging to ourselves that we were suffering. I remember the first time I broke. It was day 12, during a night navigation exercise in the Saldarian Canyon region. We had been marching for 18 hours through terrain that seemed designed by sadists. Razor-sharp rock formations, steep drops into darkness, narrow ledges where a single misstep meant a fall of 50 meters onto jagged stone. We were carrying full training packs that weighed 30 kilograms each, and we were forbidden from using our helmet lights except in designated rest areas. We navigated by starlight and memory, following maps we had been forced to memorize during a 30-minute briefing session. And anyone who strayed from the prescribed route received electric shocks from their training collar until they corrected their course. I was exhausted beyond anything I had ever experienced. My legs had stopped feeling like legs. They were just columns of pain that I moved through sheer willpower, one step after another after another. My shoulders were bleeding where the pack straps had worn through skin. My throat was raw from the dust I had been breathing for hours. And then, As I was climbing a particularly treacherous slope, my foot slipped. I fell perhaps 3 meters before I caught myself on a jutting rock. Eeks! The impact drove the breath from my lungs and sent a spike of agony through my left arm, not broken, but badly wrenched. The kind of injury that would have sent me to a medical center for a week if I had been a civilian. But I was not a civilian anymore. I was TK-4479, and TK-4479 was not permitted to stop, was not permitted to rest, was not permitted to acknowledge the screaming of damaged nerves and torn muscles. I hung there on that cliff face for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. I clung to the rock with my good arm and tried to breathe, and felt something fundamental inside me crack and give way. Not my arm. Something deeper than that. Some last remnant of who I had been before Karita. Some final spark of Kael Vosk that had survived the running and the fighting and the endless humiliation. I felt it break, and I began to cry. A recruit does not cry on Karita. Crying is a sign of emotional weakness, a behavioral deficiency that requires correction. The instructors had made this abundantly clear during our first orientation session, and I had watched 3 recruits receive punishment detail for shedding tears during the first week of training. But I could not stop. The tears came and kept coming, mixing with the dust on my face, and I sobbed like a child because I was a child. I was 17 years old, and I was hanging from a cliff in the dark on a planet I had never heard of a year ago, and everything hurt, and I wanted to go home, and there was no home to go back to because I had signed it away. I had signed everything away, and I would never be Kael again. I would never be anything but a number in a file somewhere. The instructor droid found me like that, crying, clinging, broken. It hauled me up the cliff face with its mechanical arms and deposited me on the ledge above, and its vocabulator crackled as it logged my infraction. TK-479. Emotional compromise during training exercise. Behavioral deficiency noted for review. I completed the navigation exercise. I do not remember how. I remember arriving at the extraction point as the first sun was rising over the canyon. And I remember collapsing into the transport that would take us back to the barracks. And I remember thinking that I would surely be sent to reconditioning for what I had done. But I was not sent to reconditioning, not then. The behavioral deficiency remained in my file, a mark against my record. But the instructors apparently decided that one instance of crying did not warrant removal from the training population. Others were not so fortunate. Syrah, little Syrah, who had lied about her age, who had wanted so badly to escape her stepfather, broke on day 15. We were in the middle of close-quarters combat training, drilling the same sequence of strikes and blocks over and over, until our muscles memorized the movements, and Syrah made a mistake. Her timing was off by a fraction of a second, and her sparring partner's training baton caught her across the face instead of stopping at her guard. The blow split her lip open and knocked loose one of her teeth, and she stood there with blood running down her chin, and something shifted in her eyes. She started screaming. Not from pain. The pain was nothing compared to what we had already endured, but from something inside her that had finally reached its limit. She screamed, and she did not stop screaming. And when the instructors tried to restrain her, she fought them with a ferocity that seemed impossible for such a small person. It took 4 instructor droids to hold her down, and even then, she kept screaming, kept thrashing, kept trying to claw at her own face, as though she could tear away the blood and the fear and the months of accumulated suffering. They took her away. We never saw her again. The next morning, our senior drill instructor, a man named Gravik, whose face seemed carved from the same red stone as the Carida Mountains, stood before us in formation and announced that TK-4503 had been transferred to reconditioning for psychological instability. He did not use Sira's name. He did not acknowledge that TK-4503 had been a person with a history and hopes and fears. He simply noted the transfer and moved on to the day's training schedule, and we stood at attention and said nothing because there was nothing to say. That was when I began to understand what reconditioning truly meant. The Academy did not advertise its reconditioning facility. There were no holovids about it, no orientation lectures, no official documentation that we were permitted to access. But rumors filtered through the barracks like poison gas, whispered between recruits in the brief moments when the instructors were not listening. Some said reconditioning was a euphemism for execution, that recruits who failed to meet standards were simply eliminated and their files marked as having been reassigned. Others said it was a medical procedure, a form of neural restructuring that scraped away personality and memory and left only obedience behind. Others said it was worse than either of those things, that the reconditioning center was a place of deliberate suffering designed to break any remaining resistance and rebuild the subject as a perfect servant of the Empire. I do not know which rumors were true. I know only what I saw, and what I saw was this. Recruits who were taken to reconditioning sometimes came back. They came back with the same faces and the same bodies, but something essential had been removed. They did not speak unless spoken to. They did not form connections with other recruits. They performed their duties with mechanical precision, never excelling but never failing, their movements smooth and empty and terrible to watch. Their eyes were the worst part. Their eyes looked like windows into rooms where all the furniture had been removed. I met one of them once, a boy who had been TK-4416 before reconditioning and was still TK-4416 afterward, but was not the same person in any way that mattered. We were assigned to the same sanitation detail, scrubbing the floors of the barracks latrines with chemical solutions that made our hands crack and bleed. I tried to talk to him. Not about anything important, just small talk. The kind of meaningless chatter that helped pass the time during tedious duties. He did not respond. He did not even seem to hear me. He just kept scrubbing, his movements identical from one stroke to the next. His face blank, his eyes fixed on the floor, but not really seeing it. I said his designation number, TK-4416. I said it 3 times, each time louder than the last, and on the 3rd time, his head turned toward me with a smoothness that made my skin crawl. He looked at me without recognition, without interest, without anything at all behind his gaze. This unit does not respond to unauthorized verbal contact, he said. His voice was flat, effectless. The words spoken as though he were reading them from a manual. Please direct all communications through the senior drill instructor. Then he turned back to his scrubbing, and I stood there with my hands shaking and my heart pounding and a cold certainty settling into my bones. That was what reconditioning did. That was what they would do to me if I cried again, if I screamed, if I showed any sign of being something other than the perfect soldier they were trying to create. They would cut out everything that made me human and leave only the designation behind. I did not cry again. Not once in all the months that followed. Not when Bren fell during a live fire exercise and was carried away with burns covering 70% of his body. Not when Taylor, brilliant, fierce Taylor, who had stood so strong on that first day, put her training blaster to her own head one night and pulled the trigger before anyone could stop her. Not when I received the message that my mother had died on Dantooine, alone. while I was learning how to kill for an empire that did not care about her or me or anyone except itself. I locked the tears away somewhere inside my chest, in a box made of scar tissue and numbness. And I let TK-4479 grow over Kale Vosk like new skin growing over a wound. The weapons training intensified in the second month. We graduated from training blasters to the real thing, E-11 rifles, the standard armament of the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps. The E-11 weighs 2.6 kilograms and has an effective range of 300 meters and fires plasma bolts that can punch through light armor at close range. I learned these specifications the way I learned everything else at Carida. Through repetition, through testing, through punishment for any failure to recall them instantly upon demand. The instructors would wake us in the middle of the night and demand that we recite the E-11's technical parameters from memory. Anyone who hesitated received punishment detail. Anyone who made an error received worse. We practiced assembly and disassembly until we could perform the procedure blindfolded, our fingers finding each component by touch and memory alone. We practiced marksmanship until our shoulders were permanently bruised from the rifle's recoil. We practiced room-clearing drills, moving through mock-ups of rebel bases and civilian structures, learning to sweep corners and check sight lines and neutralize targets with maximum efficiency. The targets were holographic at first, flickering projections of armed combatants that dissolved when struck by our blaster fire. Then the targets became more elaborate. Droids programmed to fight back, to take cover, to return fire with stun bolts that left painful welts wherever they struck. Then the targets became human. They did not tell us who the prisoners were. Political dissidents, perhaps, or criminals from the detention centers that dotted the outer rim. Maybe they were rebels, captured during some operation we never heard about. Maybe they were simply people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, swept up in the machinery of imperial justice and fed into the training system because bodies were needed. I do not know. I did not ask. Asking questions was not something TK-4479 did anymore. The first live target exercise took place on day 67. We assembled in a training compound that had been configured to resemble a small settlement. Prefabricated buildings, narrow streets, improvised barriers. Inside the compound, we were told, were hostile combatants armed with non-lethal weapons. Our mission was to clear the compound and neutralize all targets. We were issued live ammunition. I remember the weight of the charged power pack in my rifle. I remember the way my hands trembled as I took my position in the assault formation. I remember the voice of our squad leader, a recruit named TK-4451, who had been promoted for demonstrating exceptional aggression, calling out the breach command. Then we were moving, flowing through the compound like water seeking low ground, and I saw my first target. She was young, maybe 20 standard years, with dark hair and terrified eyes and hands that shook as she raised her stun baton in a futile defensive gesture. She was wearing civilian clothes stained with dirt and sweat, and she was screaming something that I could not hear through my helmet's audio filters, and I shot her. The bolt caught her in the chest, and she went down. And I kept moving because that was what we had been trained to do, to engage, to neutralize, to advance. I did not stop to see if she was dead. I did not stop to wonder who she had been or what she had done to end up in this place. I just kept moving, kept shooting, kept doing my duty because the alternative was reconditioning. And I had seen what reconditioning did, and I was more afraid of becoming that than I was afraid of becoming a murderer. We killed 9 people in that compound. 9 human beings, dressed in civilian clothes, armed with nothing more dangerous than stun batons and improvised shields. Afterward, we assembled in formation, while the instructors reviewed our performance, and I stood there with blood on my armor. Someone else's blood, sprayed across the white plastoid when a bolt had caught a man in the throat. And I felt nothing at all. That was when I understood that the training had worked. Not in the way the holovid suggested, not in the way the recruiters had promised. The academy had not made me a better person or a noble defender of civilization. It had simply killed the parts of me that would have objected to killing others. It had scraped away my conscience like rust from Durasteel and left behind something smooth and hard and empty. TK-4479 was not a murderer. TK-4479 was a weapon. The indoctrination sessions ran parallel to the physical training, woven through our schedule like threads of poison in a garment. Every day we sat through hours of instruction about the enemies of the Empire, their methods, their ideologies, their threat to galactic stability. We watched holovids of rebel atrocities, carefully edited to maximize their emotional impact. We studied Imperial propaganda that painted the Alliance as terrorists and criminals and monsters. And we memorized the slogans until they echoed in our dreams. Order through strength. Loyalty is life. The Empire is eternal. The instructors taught us to see ourselves as the last line of defense against chaos. They told us that the galaxy was full of people who wanted to tear down everything the Empire had built. The infrastructure, the stability, the peace that had followed the chaos of the Republic and the Clone Wars. They told us that the rebels were not freedom fighters, but destroyers. That their victory would mean the death of billions. That every act of sedition was a cancer that had to be burned away before it could spread. They told us this over and over again, day after day, until the words became part of our operating system, until questioning them felt like questioning the laws of physics. And we believed them. How could we not? We were exhausted. We were broken. We were desperate for something to believe in that would justify the suffering we had endured. The ideology gave us meaning. It told us that our pain had a purpose, that our sacrifices were necessary, that we were not simply victims of a brutal system, but warriors in a noble cause. Belief was easier than doubt. Belief was safer than thinking. I know now that almost everything they taught us was a lie. The rebels were not monsters. They were people. Ordinary people who had decided they could not live under Imperial rule any longer. The Empire did not maintain order through justice, but through terror, through the threat of overwhelming force, through the knowledge that any resistance would be met with disproportionate violence. The peace the Empire offered was the peace of the grave, the silence of populations too frightened to speak. But I did not know this on Carida. On Carida, I knew only what I was told. And I believed because the alternative was to acknowledge that I had surrendered my humanity for nothing. Some recruits tried to resist the indoctrination. They asked questions during the lectures, challenged the instructors' assertions, pointed out inconsistencies in the propaganda. These recruits did not last long. They were called out in formation, publicly humiliated, subjected to correctional interviews that left them shaking and silent for days afterward. The worst offenders were sent to reconditioning. The rest learned to keep their doubts to themselves. There was a recruit in my barracks, TK-4388, though I never learned what name he had worn before, who kept a journal. This was strictly forbidden, of course. We were not permitted to maintain any personal records or engage in any activity that prioritized individual identity over collective duty. But TK-4388 had smuggled a small datapad through processing somehow, and every night, after lights out, he would tap away at it beneath his blanket. recording his thoughts and observations in files that he encrypted with a code only he knew. I never read the journal. I do not know what he wrote in it. But I remember the night they found it, the shriek of alarm klaxons at 0300 hours, the instructor droids flooding into the barracks with their vocabulators blaring, the bright lights snapping on to reveal TK-4388 standing beside his bunk with a datapad clutched in his hands and a look of absolute terror on his face. They took him away. The next morning, Senior Drill Instructor Gravik stood before us and explained that TK-4388 had been discovered in possession of contraband materials containing seditious content. The entire barracks was placed on punishment detail for failing to report the infraction. 8 hours of hard labor in the Karita mines, breathing filtered air that still tasted like death, hauling ore carts until our hands bled through our gloves. Gravik told us that we were complicit in TK-4388's betrayal, that our failure to police our own ranks was a stain on our collective honor, that we would learn to watch each other more carefully in the future. And we did. We became informants on each other, reporting infractions, noting behavioral deficiencies, competing to demonstrate our loyalty by exposing the disloyalty of our peers. The Academy encouraged this. They called it mutual accountability. But it was really just surveillance distributed across the population, a system that ensured we could never trust each other enough to organize resistance. We were alone, even when surrounded by our squad mates, alone in a crowd of hundreds, alone in a way that made the vastness of space feel intimate by comparison. TK-4388 came back from reconditioning 3 weeks later. He was assigned to a different barracks. They always reassigned reconditioning cases, perhaps to prevent any lingering personal connections from interfering with the process. But I saw him once, from across the training yard, walking in formation with his new unit. He moved like all the others who had been through reconditioning, smooth, precise, mechanical. His face was blank. His eyes were empty. I do not know what happened to his journal. I imagine it was destroyed, along with whatever thoughts and hopes and individual perspectives he had tried to preserve. That was the point, after all. That was always the point. The Empire did not want stormtroopers who thought. The Empire wanted stormtroopers who obeyed. Month 3 brought the specialization assessments. We were tested on everything: physical fitness, marksmanship, tactical reasoning, leadership potential, psychological stability. The results determined our assignments. Which of us would become standard infantry? Which would be trained for heavy weapons or demolitions? Which would be selected for the more elite programs like Scout Trooper or Shock Trooper training? A very few, the best of the best, or perhaps just the most broken, would be flagged for consideration by more specialized units: Imperial Intelligence, the ISB, the Death Trooper program. I tested well in marksmanship and poorly in leadership. My psychological profile indicated high compliance, moderate initiative, low interpersonal attachment, a combination that the algorithms apparently found suitable for standard infantry deployment. I was relieved. I did not want to stand out. Standing out meant attention, and attention meant scrutiny. And scrutiny meant the chance of someone noticing that TK-4479 was not as empty inside as he was supposed to be. Because I was not empty. Not entirely. Some small fragment of Kyle Vosk remained, buried deep beneath the layers of conditioning and trauma and learned numbness. I did not know it then. I thought I had successfully killed that part of myself. Thought I had become the weapon the Academy intended. But looking back now, I can see the signs. The way I sometimes hesitated before firing on training targets that looked too much like civilians. The The way I flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever Senior Drill Instructor Gravik raised his voice. The way I dreamed, on the rare nights when exhaustion permitted dreams, of Dantooine's dusty fields and my mother's songs and a life that had ended when I signed my name on that recruitment form. TK-4479 was almost complete. But almost is not entirely, and that difference would matter later. That difference is why I am recording this now, why I am committing these memories to a medium that might survive me, why I am confessing the things I did and the things I failed to do in the hope that someone, someday, will understand. The armor-fitting ceremony took place on day 100. We assembled in the armory, a massive chamber filled with rack upon rack of gleaming white plastoid, and we were each assigned our personal set of Stormtrooper armor. The technicians measured us with precise instruments, adjusting each piece to fit our bodies exactly, ensuring that the armor would move with us rather than against us. The process took hours, but we stood there without complaint, without shifting our weight, without making a sound. When they finally sealed me into the suit, when I heard the soft hiss of the helmet's environmental systems activating and felt the plastoid embrace me from head to foot, I understood for the first time what it truly meant to be a Stormtrooper. The armor was not just protection. The armor was transformation. Inside the suit, I was no longer Kale Vosk from Dantooine. I was no longer even TK-4479, the individual recruit with a behavioral deficiency in his file. I was a Stormtrooper, identical to the tens of thousands who had worn this armor before me and the millions who would wear it after. My face was hidden, my voice was filtered, my body was sheathed in the uniform white of Imperial authority. The helmet was the worst part, or the best part, depending on how you looked at it. The helmet's audio processors filtered all external sounds, removing background noise and enhancing relevant stimuli. Commands from superior officers, weapons fire, target designations. The visual display provided tactical information overlaid on my field of view, marking allies and enemies, tracking movement, displaying mission objectives. The integrated comlink allowed me to communicate with my squad, my company, my commanders, without anyone outside the network hearing a word. Everything was designed to maximize my effectiveness as a combat unit and minimize my individuality as a human being. And the breathing. The helmet's respirator regulated my oxygen intake, and every breath I took came through that system, filtered and processed and delivered at a precise rate. I breathed in rhythm with the machine, my body synchronized to its cycles. And after a while, I could not remember how to breathe any other way. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself breathing in that same pattern. The slow inhale, the measured exhale, the faint hiss of air through filters that no longer exist. They showed us how to maintain the armor. The cleaning protocols, the repair procedures, the diagnostic checks that had to be performed every 12 hours. They taught us to treat the armor with reverence, to consider any damage to it as a personal failure, to understand that the suit was not just equipment, but an extension of our identity. A Stormtrooper without armor was not a Stormtrooper at all, just a deficient body waiting to be recycled. Month 4 was live combat integration. We were deployed to one of Karita's remote training zones, a region that had been seeded with monitoring equipment and populated with hostile elements for us to engage. The hostiles were a mix. Combat droids programmed to simulate rebel tactics, prisoners who had been armed and released into the zone with the promise of freedom if they survived, and occasionally other trainee units operating in opposition to our own. We spent 3 weeks in that zone, sleeping in shifts, living on field rations, fighting a war that was real enough to kill us, but controlled enough to serve the Academy's purposes. I killed 7 people during those 3 weeks. I do not know their names, or their crimes, or their stories. They were simply targets, shapes in my helmet's display, threat markers that needed to be neutralized. I shot them with clinical precision, with the mechanical efficiency I had been trained to achieve. And I felt nothing except a faint satisfaction when my shots connected and the threat markers disappeared. On the 5th night, we were ambushed by a prisoner group that had managed to capture weapons from a supply drop. They hit us at our weakest point, striking the perimeter where our sentries had grown complacent, and for a few minutes, everything was chaos. Blaster fires screaming through the darkness. Voices shouting commands and warnings over the comlink, bodies falling in the mud. I took a bolt to the shoulder, deflected by my armor, but still painful enough to knock me off my feet, and I lay there in the dirt while the firefight raged above me, and wondered if this was how I was going to die. It was not. We regrouped. We counterattacked. We killed or captured every member of the prisoner group. But 3 of my squad mates died in that ambush, and their bodies were stacked in the transport alongside the supplies when we extracted 3 days later. The Academy's after-action report called the ambush a valuable learning experience. The dead were listed as training casualties, their files marked closed, their designations recycled for the next batch of recruits. Graduation came on day 128. We assembled in the parade grounds of the Central Academy complex, 10,000 surviving trainees standing in perfect formation beneath the red sky of Carida. Lord Vader was there. I had never seen him in person before. Only holovids, only propaganda images. And the reality was nothing like the recordings. He was larger than I had expected, his black armor absorbing the light, his respirator marking time with that terrible rhythmic breathing. He stood on the reviewing platform beside Commandant Ray Sloan and a dozen other high-ranking officers, and he watched us with a presence that felt like pressure, like a physical weight bearing down on my chest. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence was the message. We belonged to him now. We belonged to the Empire, to the Emperor, to whatever dark purpose they required of us. We had survived the Academy, and our reward was to become instruments of their will. Commandant Sloan delivered the graduation address. She spoke of duty and honor and the glorious future that awaited us as servants of the new order. She told us that we had proven ourselves worthy, that we had emerged from the crucible of training as soldiers capable of defending the Empire against all threats. She told us that our sacrifices had meaning, that our suffering had purpose, that we were the sharp edge of civilization itself. I stood there in formation and listened to her words, and felt the helmet heavy on my head and the armor tight around my body, and the emptiness where my soul had been. I was TK-4479, assigned to the 501st Legion, Vader's personal unit, because my marksmanship scores had been high enough to warrant the placement. I was a Stormtrooper of the Galactic Empire. I was exactly what they had made me, and somewhere deep inside, buried beneath all the conditioning and the trauma and the deliberate destruction, some tiny fragment of Kyle Vosk was still screaming. The years after Carida blur together in my memory, a montage of battlefields and barracks and the endless white corridors of star destroyers. I served in the 501st for 6 standard years, participating in operations across the galaxy. Suppression actions on occupied worlds, anti-insurgency campaigns in the Outer Rim, boarding operations against rebel vessels. I fired my weapon more times than I can count. I killed more people than I want to remember. I followed orders without question, without hesitation, without the flicker of doubt that would have indicated some surviving trace of the person I had been before. The conditioning held. For years, it held perfectly. I was the ideal Stormtrooper, compliant, effective, utterly devoted to the mission. My superior officers noted my performance in glowing terms, recommending me for promotion, for specialized assignments, for commendations that meant nothing except that I was very good at killing whoever the Empire told me to kill. I accepted these acknowledgments without pride or pleasure. Emotions were not part of my operating parameters, but some part of me must have registered them, because I remember them now. I remember the campaign on Kashyyyk, where we hunted Wookiee resistance fighters through forests that seemed to go on forever, the trees so tall that their canopy blotted out the sky. I remember the siege of the Fondor shipyards, where rebel saboteurs had infiltrated the workforce and we had to identify and eliminate them one by one, questioning workers who might have been innocent or might have been enemies. There was no way to know until the interrogations were complete. I remember the pacification of Lothal, where the population had grown sympathetic to the rebellion, and we were deployed to remind them of the cost of disloyalty. I remember Jeddah. I was not there when the Death Star fired. That happened while I was on a transport heading elsewhere. But I was part of the occupation force in the months leading up to the destruction. We patrolled streets filled with pilgrims and scholars and ordinary people who had committed no crime except living on a world that contained something the Empire wanted. I watched as the Kyber mines consumed the holy city piece by piece, as sacred sites were demolished to make way for extraction equipment, as the people of Jeddah were forced to choose between submission and annihilation. And I remember Alderaan. Not the death of the planet. I was not there for that either. But the aftermath. The waves of horror that rippled through the galaxy when word spread of what the Empire had done. The way the rebels fought harder after that. The way their desperation crystallized into something that almost looked like hope. I remember standing in a corridor on the Star Destroyer Devastator, my helmet held in my hands because we had been given a rare moment of rest. And I remember hearing the announcement over the shipwide comms. Alderaan destroyed, 2 billion lives extinguished in an instant. A world reduced to rubble to demonstrate the Empire's power. I felt something then. For the first time in years, something stirred behind the conditioning. Something that was not compliance or aggression or the mechanical satisfaction of duty performed. It was small, just a flicker, a shadow of an emotion. But it was there. Horror, grief, the faintest whisper of a question. Is this what I am fighting for? I pushed it down. I locked it away in the box where Kale Vosk lived, buried beneath years of training and combat and the deliberate erasure of everything that might have made me question my orders. I put my helmet back on and returned to my duties, and did not allow myself to think about what I had felt. But the crack was there now. A hairline fracture in the conditioning that would slowly widen over time. The cracks spread. They always spread, given enough time and enough pressure. Mine took years to become visible. But they were there from the moment I heard about Alderaan, growing with every atrocity I witnessed, every order I followed that some buried part of me knew was wrong. By the time the Death Star was destroyed at Yavin, I had begun to question, not openly, not even consciously, but in dreams and quiet moments and the spaces between thoughts. I was on Tatooine when I first truly saw myself. We had been deployed to locate the droids carrying the stolen Death Star plans, and I was part of the squad that interrogated the local population in Mos Eisley. We questioned them the way we always questioned civilians, with weapons drawn, with threats implied, with the absolute certainty that our authority gave us the right to do anything we wanted to, anyone we wanted for any reason we chose. Most of them cooperated immediately. A few required persuasion. There was a moisture farmer, a weathered old man who reminded me, in some distant way, of my father, who refused to answer our questions. He claimed ignorance of the droids, claimed he had no connection to the rebellion, claimed he was simply a citizen of the Empire, trying to live his life in peace. Our squad leader did not believe him. Squad leaders never believed protestations of innocence. That was not what the training taught them to do. I watched as they beat him. I stood there in my armor, my weapon ready, my helmet hiding whatever expression might have been on my face. And I watched as they struck him over and over until he stopped claiming innocence and started begging for mercy. He did not know anything about the droids. He really was just a moisture farmer. But we beat him anyway, because that was what Stormtroopers did. And when it was over, I helped drag his broken body into the street and left him there for the medical droids to find. That night, alone in my bunk aboard the Star Destroyer, I took off my helmet and looked at my reflection in the polished surface. I had not really looked at myself in years, not beyond the cursory inspection of ensuring my appearance met regulations. But I looked then, and what I saw was a stranger. A face I barely recognized, aged beyond its years, with eyes that held nothing except exhaustion and the faint glimmer of something that might have been despair. "Who are you?" I asked myself. "What have you become?" "TK-4479, the answer came back. "Stormtrooper, instrument of Imperial order." But underneath that answer, fainter but persistent, another voice whispered, "Murderer, monster, machine." The Battle of Yavin changed everything. When the Death Star exploded, when a single rebel pilot destroyed the technological terror that was supposed to guarantee the Empire's supremacy forever, something shifted in the galaxy. I felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, a subtle alteration in the quality of the universe that meant nothing would ever be the same. The Empire responded to Yavin with fury. Our operations intensified, our methods became harsher. Our willingness to accept collateral damage expanded until there was almost no distinction between enemy combatant and civilian bystander. We were sent to crush any hint of rebellion sympathy wherever it appeared, and we crushed with abandon. Villages burned, cities fell. Populations that had simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time were processed through detention centers and labor camps, and worse. I participated in all of it. I followed my orders. I did what I was trained to do. But the cracks in my conditioning were widening now, letting in light that burned away the comfortable numbness I had maintained for so long. I started noticing things I had trained myself not to see. The terror in civilians' eyes when we entered a settlement, the bodies left in our wake that had clearly posed no threat. The way our officers spoke about non-imperial populations as though they were vermin to be exterminated rather than people to be governed. I noticed, too, the way some of my fellow stormtroopers seemed to enjoy the violence. Not all of them. Many were like me, hollowed out and mechanical. But some had found something in the killing that fed a hunger I did not share. They volunteered for the worst assignments, the punitive operations, the missions where civilian casualties were not just expected, but encouraged. They laughed about their kills during downtime, compared body counts like children comparing toys, spoke about the rebellion and its sympathizers with a hatred that seemed too hot, too personal, too alive. I did not hate the rebels. I realized this one day while standing guard outside an interrogation chamber, listening to the screams of someone being questioned about rebel activities. I should have hated them. The training had been designed to instill that hatred, to make me see them as existential threats to everything I valued. But all I felt was tiredness, a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical fatigue and everything to do with the weight of what I had become. Perhaps that was when the conditioning finally failed. Perhaps my Yavin-sparked doubts had simply grown too large to contain. Perhaps there was something in me, some fragment of Kael Vosk that had never truly died, that finally found enough strength to surface. Whatever the cause, I began to make choices that deviated from my programming. Small choices at first, warning shots that went deliberately wide, allowing targets to escape. Reports that omitted information about suspected rebel sympathizers. Medical supplies left where civilians could find them after we moved on. Nothing that could be traced back to me, nothing that risked exposure, but enough to let me believe I was still capable of something other than evil. Then larger choices. A family on Sullust that I was supposed to detain for questioning. I looked the other way as they fled their home, pretended not to see them slip through our perimeter. A wounded rebel on Ord Mantell who should have been executed on the spot. I called for medical evacuation instead, claiming he had intelligence value. A village elder on Ryloth who begged me to spare his granddaughter. I altered my report to indicate she had died in the initial assault rather than been taken alive. Each deviation was a risk. Each choice could have been detected, could have resulted in my execution or worse. But I kept making them, driven by something I could not name, something that felt like the first stirrings of humanity returning after years of dormancy. I do not tell you this to paint myself as a hero. I was not a hero. The good I did was a fraction of the evil, a single drop of clean water in an ocean of blood. I killed far more people than I saved. I participated in atrocities that will haunt me until I die. The choices I made were not redemption. They were simply evidence that something human had survived the Academy's attempts to destroy it. But they were enough. Enough to convince me that change was possible. Enough to make me believe that even weapons can choose not to fire. The end came on Hoth. I was part of the ground assault force, advancing through the ice under Lord Vader's command, hunting rebels through a world that seemed determined to kill us even faster than our enemies could. The cold penetrated our armor despite the heating units, froze our breath in our helmets, made every movement an exercise in agony. We pushed forward anyway, because that was what Stormtroopers did, and because Lord Vader's presence behind us was more terrifying than anything the ice could threaten. I found a rebel in one of the evacuation tunnels. A young woman, maybe 19 or 20 standard years, pinned beneath a collapsed support beam with her legs shattered and her weapon out of reach. She looked up at me with eyes that held no hope, only resignation. She expected me to kill her. That was what Stormtroopers did. I stood there for a long moment, my rifle aimed at her chest, my finger on the trigger. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of battle, blaster fire, explosions, the screams of the dying. My squad was moving past, focused on the mission, assuming I would handle this target and catch up. No one was watching. I lowered my weapon. The rebel stared at me with confusion that slowly transformed into something like wonder. I said nothing. I did not trust my voice, did not know what words could possibly justify what I was doing or failing to do. I just knelt beside her and began working to free her leg from the debris. She did not speak either. Perhaps she understood that speech was unnecessary, that what was happening transcended language. I freed her leg, helped her to her feet, supported her weight as she limped toward the evacuation routes that her comrades were using to escape. We moved in silence through the tunnels, two enemies who had temporarily become something else. And when we reached a junction where her path diverged from mine, she turned and looked at me. "Why?" she asked. Just that. Just the one word. I not have an answer. Or rather, I had too many answers. Answers about conditioning and dehumanization and the slow death of the soul. Answers about choices and consequences and the possibility of change. But none of them felt adequate. So I said nothing. I just turned and walked away, back toward my squad, back toward the battle, back toward the empire I had served for so long and could no longer truly believe in. I was reported missing in action at Hoth. The official records indicate that TK-4479 was lost during the ground assault, presumed killed when a section of the ice tunnels collapsed. In reality, I deserted, slipped away in the chaos of the evacuation, discarded my armor piece by piece in the snow, became just another refugee fleeing the Empire's wrath. The years since have been difficult. I have lived under false names in the shadowed corners of the galaxy, always moving, always watching for the white armored figures that haunt my dreams. I have worked manual labor on backwater worlds, have eaten what I could find, have slept in places no human should have to sleep. I have sometimes wondered if the life I chose was worth the price, if the freedom I claimed was better than the purpose I abandoned. And now I am dying. The doctors say it is a degenerative condition, something in my bone marrow, probably caused by exposure to the chemicals we used during the Kashyyyk campaign. I have weeks left, maybe less. I am recording this confession because I need someone to know, not to judge. I have judged myself harshly enough, not to forgive. Forgiveness is not something I have the right to ask for. Just to know, to understand what the Empire does to the people it claims to serve, what it takes from them, what it leaves behind. The academy at Karita is still operational. New recruits arrive every quarter, 10,000 young people who believe what I once believed, who dream what I once dreamed. They will be broken and remade, transformed into weapons, sent out to kill and die for an empire that considers them expendable. Some will serve faithfully until their deaths. Some will be reconditioning. A few, a very few, will find some way to resist, to preserve some fragment of who they were, to make choices that deviate from their programming. To those few, if any of you ever hear this recording, I offer what wisdom I can. The conditioning is strong, but it is not absolute. The Empire's power is vast, but it is not invincible. You were a person before you were a designation, and that person still exists somewhere inside you, waiting for the chance to emerge. Find them. Hold on to them. Let them guide you when the orders make no sense and the propaganda rings hollow. Be more than what they made you. I am TK-4479. I was Kale Vosk. I was a weapon, and I chose to lower my rifle. I was a machine, and I chose to remember my humanity. I was a Stormtrooper, and I chose, in the end, to be something else. This is my confession. This is my truth. This is the grim reality of what the Empire's training creates. Not soldiers, but slaves. Not defenders, but destroyers. Not men and women, but numbers in files. Bodies in armor, ghosts wearing the faces of people who died the day they put on the helmet for the first time. The Emperor is dead now. I heard the news on some outer rim station, saw the hollows of Endor's celebration, watched the footage of the second Death Star's destruction. The Empire is fragmenting, its forces scattered, its ideology crumbling. Somewhere in the galaxy, rebels are becoming a new republic, building something to replace what they tore down. Perhaps it will be better. Perhaps it will simply be a different kind of broken. I will not live to see it. But I will die knowing that I made choices, bad choices, evil choices, choices that I can never undo or atone for. And also different choices, small choices, choices that might have saved a few lives in the midst of all the lives I took. I will die knowing that the weapon they created looked at its own reflection and chose to question what it saw. That has to be worth something, even if it is not worth enough. My name was Kale Vosk. My designation was TK-4479. I was a Stormtrooper of the Galactic Empire, trained at the Academy on Karida, a graduate of a program designed to destroy everything human inside me and replace it with obedience and violence. They almost succeeded. Almost.